Hello, everybody. Welcome to our AMA. I'm Miguel. I am the community manager for Kadena, and I want to welcome everybody. Today, we're featuring Kyle Samani from Multicoin Capital, and we have Will Martino from Kadena, CEO. So we want to thank everyone for joining us, and we want to especially thank those of you who submitted questions to us. And we want to get started with some quick intros and a little background for people who may not be familiar with either of our guests. So we'll start with Kyle.
Hey everyone, my name is Kyle Samani. I'm a co-founder and managing partner at Multicoin Capital. We're a crypto fund based in Austin, Texas. We have been around formally as a fund since October of 2017. So I guess we're coming in on 18 months now, which I think by crypto standards is old, although by most other standards it's not very old. We spend basically all of our time and energy learning about the crypto space and investing in both protocols and companies in and around blockchain. We bias more towards tokens than equity, but we do invest in both. We have, I think, 12 full-time employees now in both Austin, and we have a handful in New York. Sorry, Will and I met at Consensus Invest in November 2017. And we had the good fortune to invest, I think, just a couple months thereafter. So we've been investors now for, I think, a year and change or so. I'm relatively known for having somewhat contrarian views in the crypto space. I'm also somewhat well known for publishing a blog at multicoin.capital's website that talks about all kinds of things: valuations, token models, technology stacks, kind of all of the above. I love writing. I've been writing since 2013, and it fortunately fits well in crypto. So that's a quick summary and introduction to Kyle and Multicoin.
Great, thanks, Kyle. So let's hear from Will. Will, go for it.
Sure. So I am Will Martino, founder and CEO of Kadena. Quick background was that I got my start in crypto in probably one of the stranger ways. I was at the SEC as the lead engineer for a quant group that was building data analysis tools that are now used nationwide. And when I was there, Valerie started the cryptocurrency working group, and I raised my hand to be the first tech lead. Ended up working on some exams of different exchanges that went down, and then eventually got tired of working in the government, left, went to JP Morgan. And that's where I met my co-founder, Stuart Popejoy. He was running a desk in the group that became the Blockchain Center of Excellence, which then went on to sometime later release Quorum. Stu and I started working on blockchain and also building out a team there pretty quickly, and we built and deployed effectively JP Morgan Coin version 0. This was running on top of Juno, which was at that time, I think it was the fastest private blockchain. It was doing international payments inside of JP Morgan. It was open source, released a Hyperledger, and then Stu and I left after about a year of working on blockchain because we had all these technical questions we knew needed to get answered and didn't think that being at JP Morgan was the right place to push emerging tech. Founded Kadena in 2016 with him. We focused on enterprise for the first year, building out a high performance private chain, so deterministic BFT, consensus, and Pact, our smart contract language. And after about a year, we got a couple clients and started working on putting Pact onto a public chain, which is, and then as we started thinking about putting it onto a public chain, Chainweb kind of was something that we discovered, innovated in consensus, however you want to define it. And that'll be the topic of this AMA. One thing I do want to say is, again, to thank Kyle for taking the time and for being a supporter for so long. One of my favorite parts about Kyle is that he has strong opinions and he doesn't hesitate to say them loudly and go on the record with them. And in this space, that can be a bit rare. So it's one of the things I appreciate most in Kyle. So I'm hoping this is going to be a great conversation about proof of work versus proof of stake.
Awesome. Well, hey, thank you so much again for the chance to be here and for the opportunity to be an early investor. Let's jump into this.
For sure. Thank you for the intros. I want to go over the format of the AMA real quick. So for those of you listening, I want you to ask your questions in the Ask Kadena thread. It's the text channel to the left. And then if you see a question you like, add a reaction to the question in chat. The questions with the most reactions will get priority. And just so you're aware, some of the questions might be answered by the Kadena team in chat. So again, like Kyle and Will both said, this conversation is going to be about proof of work and proof of stake. So before we dive into the details, can you both please help level set with a brief explanation of proof of work and proof of stake? So what are the goals for each of the consensus mechanisms? So I want to start with you, Kyle.
Yeah, sure. So if you think about consensus algorithms, what they do, kind of as the name implies, which is they bring a group of parties together who don't trust each other, and these parties have to come to an agreement about kind of the global state of the system, or at least the state of some fraction of the kind of global state. And so, prior to Bitcoin, no one had really figured out a way to get a whole bunch of distrusting actors to agree on the global state of the ledger or of some state in the world. The breakthrough of Bitcoin was, of course, in proof of work. And proof of work was a novel way that kind of combined economics, game theory, cryptography, and a number of other kind of ideas to come up with a way where you could actually incentivize this group of distrusting people to agree on the state of the ledger. And basically, right, the idea was, well, if you just find the next block and expend the computing power, then you get the right to add blocks to the end of the ledger. It's very clever, very simple, and turns out proof of work solves all kinds of problems that exist in proof of stake systems. Proof of stake systems differ from proof of work systems in that you can think of them almost just like very traditionally, like voting. You can basically say, look, these are the 100 people who are going to vote on whether we add a, they're going to vote on kind of adding the next block to the ledger. And so proof of stake systems have a number of problems they need to deal with. First need to deal with, well, of those 100 people, who gets to propose the block? Then you need to have all kinds of weird problems with, well, what if the guy is malicious and proposes 2 blocks? You've got all kinds of weird nothing at stake and long range attacks, and there's kind of a whole series of problems that emerge if you basically just try and do a very simple coin weighted voting mechanism. And so proof of stake systems have existed in theory for God knows how long, probably 4 or 5 years now, but have really only started to become deployed in any meaningful sense, or, in the last year, maybe even last few months, just because they have so many kind of, I'd say, mechanical problems that there are known solutions to. And the nice thing about proof of work is it's just very simple, and proof of work kind of conveniently solves basically all of the mechanical problems with proof of stake.
Yeah, sounds really, really interesting stuff here. Will, you have anything to add to that?
So Kyle did a great job in kind of introing the two topics. I think the only thing that I would add to it is kind of an intuition about one of the core differences between, how kind of proof of work solves this open consensus problem that proof of stake is kind of attempting to replicate, but without the mechanism that proof of work uses. And that's that proof of work is unique in that it allows people to, I mean, they're both about voting. It's just how are you voting? In proof of stake, you are quite literally voting, and you're kind of taking Paxos and traditional visiting fault tolerant consensus algorithms and building them out to be these public, really production ready systems. And with proof of work, you have this weird ability to be able to get a vote by the amount of energy, by the amount of mining that's put in on a block. That and that does kind of represent a vote. And you don't have to know who is voting before the vote takes place. And that's the really weird part of proof of work. And it's kind of this intuitive thing I like to bring up in that, I don't know of another system where you can have a totally open anonymous vote that still actually functions. And it was just this masterstroke of design with Bitcoin that allowed it to become what it is today.
Yeah, yeah, super, super interesting perspective. So I actually want to get into our first question, user submitted from @Shawd Freder. Can POS and POW not live in tandem while serving different purposes?
Sure, you
Uh,
want me to lead off?
Go for it, Will.
Sure. So, this is a topic that I was recently talking about with a lab that put out a Ethereum app a few, maybe like 6 months ago, and they recently did an upgrade to it. So proof of work is related to this concept. So proof of stake fundamentally there is this kind of ledger of who is allowed to vote and what their stake is, and then all the logic around what happens if someone acts maliciously. How do they need to kind of pony up more capital? How do they take their capital out? There's this lump of logic, and it's actually possible to run a proof of stake, the staking logic, inside of a proof of work network. You need a sufficiently complicated or sophisticated smart contract language, but there's actually no reason that you couldn't put that logic of who's allowed to vote on this other network inside of a proof of work network like Kadena's Chainweb, for example. The future, for me at least, of blockchain isn't a proof of stake's going to win or proof of work's going to win or just one chain is going to win. I think that there'll be standardization on smart contracts, just the language, just because they're very hard and expensive to build to really work. But I think the future is going to have proof of work and proof of stake running in tandem and possibly even being hybridized, where you have kind of think of it like the spokes in Cosmos, where people stake off of the hub onto the spoke. The spoke is its own kind of staked network, and it's running some application. There's no reason that that staking and that aspect of who is allowed to participate in that side network can't take place on a proof of work network. So this is this idea that we've been talking about more recently of hybrid applications, which is that you can run part of an application in a smart contract on a public proof of work network, and then have a private or at least a not totally open proof of work network on the side that links to that contract that's on the public network. And the reason that you would do this is that you don't have to pay for gas in anywhere near the same way on a private-ish, or really like really think like Spoke from Cosmos, on kind of that private chain or that deterministic, more closed universe as you do on like the public chain where gas is really expensive.
Um, so this is Kyle here. The only other thing I would add is that we actually already have seen some hybrid proof of work, proof of stake systems in the wild. So if you look at both Dash as well as Decred and what was proposed for Ethereum called Casper FFG, which has now been scrapped, these systems all rely on proof of work to basically find the person who's allowed to propose the next block, and then the next the next miner builds on kind of the prior block. So both Decred and Dash kind of share that mechanism. What Decred and Dash offer on top of that is then they allow coin holders to stake their coin and then basically finalize a block, or basically agree on a block. And so the idea here is that there's a few kind of interesting thoughts and motivations around this. The first is by adding that kind of proof of stake layer on top of the proof of work, you get some interesting benefits. The first is you get actual finality. So one of the funny things with proof of work networks is transactions are never actually finalized. They're just they probabilistically approach 100% finality, and after 99.99999, you can basically assume it's 100. But that you don't actually ever get to 100%. And so proof of stake networks can actually give you true finality, and there are some applications where that's a particularly nice thing to have. The other kind of cool thing about layering proof of stake on top of proof of work is that if the coin holders don't trust the miners, and by definition, these are adversarial networks, so you can argue they shouldn't ever trust the miners, then the proof of stake, the coin holders can actually reject blocks entirely, such that would disincentivize miners from acting maliciously or do anything else that's stupid. And so there's kind of a number of interesting mechanisms that combine some of the best elements of both types of principles into one system. And again, both of those, as I described them, are live today in Dash and Decred.
There's another one actually to add to that, and those are two very interesting approaches to like kind of fusing the two different consensus mechanisms. The one that I'd add to it, I think that maybe it's Tron that does this. I can't remember off the top of my head, but there's a few of them now that pure proof of work networks that say that in the base binary that actually runs the mining node, that a fork that is presented to the network that is longer, that goes back in time or back in blocks longer than X, will just be rejected, even if it's the longer of the two. Now, this is kind of introducing this notion of weak subjectivity or weak objectivity or weak subjectivity. I can't remember the right term that they use for proof of stake, into a proof of work network. In that, if someone were to come along, think the Ethereum Classic example. If you had that aspect of, if you had this ability to just reject a really long fork, a long-lived fork that you hadn't seen before, then you would result in the actual protocol itself, the base ledger, forking, and they're now just two different versions, and they'll never reconcile. And that may actually end up being something that is a feature, where so long as you make it, with proof of work, it's probabilistic, so it goes up to like 99%, 99.999, whatever, but it never goes to 100. But saying, okay, if we're 10x confirmation depth, so if your confirmation depth is 6, let's say we're 60 blocks deep, that all of the exchanges and all the exchanges just come to this agreement that they're going to say, we're never going to use, like, we're all going to talk with each other and make sure that our ledgers are synced up, and we're all going to also reject a fork that is longer than, say, 60, that goes back in time further than that. And it's actually a way that you can protect against these really long-lived 51% attacks, but we haven't seen too many of them in the wild yet.
Yeah, I mean, definitely two things that I heard from the both of you is just more unity between both consensus mechanisms and just a bit more collaboration between projects. There's no reason why projects can't get together and work, even though it's different consensus mechanisms. But there's an idea of a question more of centralized mining from at Marmalade, and a similar question from Beaver. How do projects plan to prevent mining centralization, which is observed for a lot of them? Ethereum is suffering immensely from it as nodes fail to upgrade with each fork. So he's just curious to hear what the solution is on a long-term basis. I'll start with Will.
So it's a tricky problem, and I'm not actually sure that it's possible to solve it for proof of work or proof of stake and have a kind of open, anonymous base protocol. If you're going to reveal who the actual identity of all the stakers on a proof of stake network, then you would be able to make these requirements and say, okay, this thing needs to be really decentralized. But for mining decentralization, I would almost repivot the question and say that, like, large scale miners, one of the biggest problems we have with proof of work is that the miners and the users and the businesses that are running the network, all of their interests aren't aligned yet. And if you were to align them all in the same direction, then you could get into a situation where you don't really mind if you have large miners, because the miners want the same thing that you want and that businesses want. So right now, users don't want there to be too much mining centralization. The miners want to have more users and more throughput, and that's how we got kind of the Bitcoin Cash fork. But if you were to have a network where greater adoption is like, a way that miners want more users, users want lower fees, and businesses want to know that the throughput of the actual network is going to be there to support their business. If you can have a network that has a clear roadmap to getting all three of those at the same time, then it becomes a little bit less of a concern. And large scale miners start to become actually a pretty useful feature for the network. And this is what Chainweb does. So, we start with 10 chains braided in parallel, and then we can hard fork to larger and larger configurations. So we go from 10 to 20, 20 to 100, 100 to 500, etc. And that increases the throughput every time. The energy use stays basically the same, but it also decreases congestion because you have more throughput. So you end up in the situation where the miners are acting as the global load balancers and global validators of the entire network, the high throughput, proof of work transactional network that's running. And you end up not minding it as much because the big miners, they don't want to spend capital for no reason to just say, okay, we're going to hard fork to 100,000 chains. They only want to go to the point at which it's going to be profitable for them. But it's in your interest for them to also say, okay, we want to, your interests and their interests end up being kind of the same, in that you don't want to pay high fees, so you want lower congestion of the network itself, so you hard fork to a bigger configuration. It's kind of my answer to it.
Yeah. So just to layer on to that, it's not clear to me that you can't avoid it in the long run. I mean, with what we've seen with proof of work networks specifically is that all hashing algorithms can be ASICed. There were hypotheses for things that couldn't be ASICed. Ethereum was supposed to be hard. Litecoin was supposed to be hard. Monero was supposed to be hard. But basically, every kind of a hypothesis around preventing chip manufacturers from developing specialized circuits, those hypotheses seem to have failed, and we actually now have quite a bit of ample market evidence to suggest that that's not possible. And so I don't think you can. I don't think you can economically prevent centralization of miners. What you can do is, as the market gets more efficient over time, is you'd expect multiple chip manufacturers to arise, and so Bitmain has been a monopoly in Bitcoin mining for some time. That is changing, and I expect that trend to accelerate, kind of moving forward. And so, if you decentralize the actual chip manufacturing, yeah, you may end up with a relatively small pool of mining node operators, but at least you kind of decentralize the manufacturing, and it's not clear um, that it matters that the number of block producers is centralized, as long as there are enough nodes maintaining the system. Right, full nodes keep miners honest. And so a good example of this would actually be like the SegWit 2x hard fork, which ultimately failed, but people were signaling they're not going to run the 2x software, and that means they would reject miners' blocks. There was another time in 2014 or 2015, I forget, where some miners were producing invalid blocks and full nodes rejected those blocks. So I don't think it's a problem that there's not that many people who can propose blocks. What is important is that there are a lot of people who can verify blocks. And then this is actually, when you look at something like Kadena, this is extra beneficial because, right, like the big concern in Bitcoin is if we increase the block size, is that people won't be able to download blocks on their computers at home. What's nice about Kadena is because of Chainweb, you kind of break the system up into all these pieces. You can keep the requirements relatively light for any given thread or braid in the chain in the system, such that you can always ensure that there's a maximum number of people who can verify the work that the miners do.
Great. So this next question is one of the more heavy hitting ones that we got over the past couple of days, and a bunch of people asked this. So, what are your thoughts on the environmental implications of proof of work energy consumption? So, I'll drop this one off to you, Kyle.
Yeah. So in the long run, I don't think it's as big of a deal as people make it out to be. Um, so a few things. So one, a lot of the energy that's going into proof of work mining is coming from energy that would be otherwise basically burned or wasted. So the kind of dams in China, the geothermal stuff in Iceland, there's the solar power, the solar wind farms in Texas, all these kinds of places. These are actually places, there's a lot of parts of the electricity grid that produce too much energy, and they cannot transport that energy to other parts of the grid that need it. And so those sections of the grid actually comprise a huge percentage of overall Bitcoin mining. So you see the stats like Bitcoin requires more energy than the country of Iceland or whatever. That's really just not a reasonable statement, because it doesn't really account for the fact that so much of Bitcoin mining today, or all proof of work mining, happens in that kind of lens. So the problem is generally overstated. The other thing that's nice about Bitcoin mining is it gives entrepreneurs a strong reason to innovate, to come up with clever electricity solutions. Um, so like let's say Bitcoin, let's just say for simple math that Bitcoin produces 1%, drives marginal energy consumption 1% on a global basis, which we have no reason to believe it's at 1% or even close to 1%, but let's just say it's 1% for simple math. Well, if entrepreneurs around the world can devise ways to produce electricity on average 1% more efficiently around the world, then that actually reduces, right, aggregate energy, kind of consumption of natural resources. And so the nice thing about Bitcoin is it actually gives you a lot of motive to find new ways to produce energy more efficiently. So overall, kind of as I put on, both the fact that a lot of energy is free and the fact that for the energy that's not free, there's a strong motivation to find cheaper ways to do it. Overall, I'm not very concerned about kind of the long term environmental impacts.
Yeah, those yeah, a great kind of summary of a lot of my thoughts. Only I think one thing I'd add to the discussion of how the electricity grid works is that a lot of people aren't aware of this, that the grid, we don't really have the ability to store electricity in large quantities right now. Probably the best example of to what ends you have to go to is there's a man-made lake out in Britain that when the grid has excess energy, the turbines that are below the lake, because the lake's up in a mountain, the turbines pump water into this lake. And then when the grid needs more energy, they switch the direction and the turbines generate electricity to put back into the grid. It's incredibly inefficient, but it does exist. So this is one of the like the weird things of the electricity grid is that let's say that the numbers are right and that Bitcoin does use some hilariously large amount of electricity, and the numbers are not right, but it doesn't matter, and it's more than, I don't know, the country of Iceland. The dam in, I think it's Sichuan, in China, where a lot of the Bitcoin mining goes on, that dam itself produces more electricity than the average that is wasted, that is just like excess, than the country of Iceland itself uses on an average basis. It's just that we have this tremendous amount of extra electricity because that's how the grid works. So a lot of the times people actually get paid, you can get these into these arrangements where the electricity company will pay you to take the electricity because they need to get rid of it somehow. And a lot of miners do actually work off of kind of these kind of spot rates for electricity. I think the other thing that I would mention is that, and this is a book recommendation for people, is there's a book called "Trust Me, I'm Lying," and it's about how you use the blogosphere and modern media to make something that isn't true into reality. And it talks about how you start with very like low level base blog, and then how you get citations and you have interviews, and how you make this idea, this concept that isn't real, become not only truth but also make it onto the front page of like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. And we've seen this tactic, and this book, by the way, Trust Me, I'm Lying, it lays out the playbook for how to do this. I don't know if it still works, but we actually have seen it in the wild, in how the whole, all the stories about how Bitcoin is going to use more electricity than the rest of the world, than the entire world in 2 or 3 years, or how it's all dirty energy from China, from coal plants. In that, all of the citations and all the research come from one blog that is just digeconomist.com. And then even in that blog, when they reference numbers from bitcoinenergyconsumption.com actually redirects back to that blog. And you can actually, like, there now are some really good debunking articles about this. You can watch how the person who is behind this built this story up and brought it further and got it into the limelight, and then got peer-reviewed papers that were based off this false assumption. So the notion that Bitcoin is, is affecting global warming in any reasonable way whatsoever is just utterly false. And it's actually a pretty amazing trick of using the modern media kind of system against itself.
Yeah, definitely some interesting stuff, especially the title of the reference that you're making. And Dejected Brown Peacock just dropped a link in the chat saying campers study on mining. 80% of it is green slash hydro. So interesting stuff. But our next question comes from, which got upvoted a lot. Sorry if I mispronounce your name, but Shanawaz. Do you guys feel it's a tragedy that proof of work burns so much money a year in scams and thefts? And we'll start with you, Will.
No. So I come from a traditional banking background. I would disagree with the premise of the question. And I think the question is, proof of work is burning billions of dollars in energy a year, even more than all scams and thefts combined. The second part is just wrong. And isn't this a big tragedy? No, it's not. This energy, most of it would go to waste anyway, because this is all excess. And for the parts that aren't, the until Bitcoin existed, the way, if you wanted to have a global currency that would be accepted everywhere, is you needed to have a country and an army. And like the energy requirements of having a country and an army to back the US dollar is tremendous. The idea that you could secure a global ledger of value and all you had to do was pay for the energy required to mine it, that is, to someone who's come from big finance, that's amazing. Like, that is such a amazing feature. It's not a bug. We know exactly what the energy requirements are. We have the ability to actually, I'll get into that one in a second. We know what the energy requirements are. We know what the security parameters are. This is just a tremendous step forward of, okay, well, I don't need an army anymore to have a notion of value. It's crazy. The second bit is that one of the existing system today, it is not good at using energy where the energy is cheap and renewable. So, for example, if you want to go and ship around $1 million in an armored car in New York City, that armored car is really heavy. It uses a huge amount of diesel, and diesel's the only thing that you can use to like just move the money from one bank to another in Manhattan. And it's stop and go traffic. It's just like, it's very bad for the environment. Whereas with Bitcoin, you can secure a block But like where the energy is getting used, you can move the site of energy usage right next to the source of where the excess energy is coming from, right next to where the green energy is coming from. And that's also a tremendous step forward in that we can actually decouple the actual transfer value from the place that it is secured. So to me, no, this is a feature. It's not a bug. It's an amazing feat of engineering that we can even talk about securing billions, if not trillions of dollars, and all we have to do is pay for some electricity.
Yeah, the only thing I would add on top of that is, right, like miners mine because they have a profit motive, right? Miners are fundamentally arbitragers. If the cost of a coin is, let's say, is $10 and it costs $8 to mine the coin, then they make $2 of profit. So if in proof of work systems, that means they, find electricity and consume electricity to produce the coins. And proof of stake systems, that just means locking up capital and staking it in that system. And that comes with a natural opportunity cost of capital. And so, Will did a good job talking about the environmental cost, but the flip side is that in both systems, right, like these systems quite literally print money. And people will always, if we know how much money the system is going to print, people will spend up to that much money to get the kind of freely printed money. And so, whether that is being spent in the form of mining equipment and electricity, or whether that's being spent in the form of opportunity cost of capital, those are effectively the same thing in economic terms. So I don't think proof of work is more inefficient kind of on a financial basis. And then Will did a good job kind of covering the environmental one.
Yeah, yeah, I completely agree with the both of you. We have our next question from ZK Snuff. He says, wealth centralization is easier in proof of work systems than POS, given all their factors are equivalent. Do you guys agree? And then another user, Crypto Moon, asks, how do you plan to widely or fairly distribute wealth after having private sales? So we'll start that off with Kyle.
Yeah. So first part of the question is, does wealth centralize more in proof of work or proof of stake systems? So there's a theoretical argument that wealth will concentrate more in proof of stake systems than proof of work systems, because if you have coins, you can stake them. While that is theoretically true, in practice, we have no real reason yet to believe it will be true. So I hesitate to bank on that. The flip side is that because proof of work mining is so centralized, wealth creation by definition happens around the handful of people who can get into mining. So it's hard to compare the two. There's valid arguments both ways. I think we'll need years of empirical data to be able to really make the argument one way or the other. My intuition is that those differences on kind of a long-term wealth creation perspective, or I should say wealth centralization perspective, are relatively immaterial in the grand scheme of things. So that was first half of the question. What was the second half of the question?
The second half was how's it easier in proof of work systems than proof of stake, given all other factors are equivalent?
So he did that part. So the second part was, I think, really just for probably
token
just for me.
distribution. That's what it was.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. So right. So there's a whole bunch of interesting ways you can get your tokens out there. So mining on proof of work is very obvious, a natural one. But you can do all kinds of other things. I mean, you can do Merkle mines like LivePeer did. You could what's it called? You can basically ask people who, like, let's say someone's mined Bitcoin or mined Ethereum. You could ask them that if they could submit their proofs that they mine blocks, to your new chain, and you could kind of set up some relay type systems to distribute coins to those miners. You can do things like, so for example, CoinList is doing like an airdrop kind of a thing to allow you to get coins out there. So there's a whole bunch of people working on innovative ways to kind of distribute coins. And this is, I think, probably more important in proof of stake systems than proof of work, but certainly is applicable to both.
Yeah. So let me go back to that question. Yeah, I'm with Kyle on this one about wealth centralization and proof of work versus proof of stake. I think we just need way more data. The only that technical kind of fundamental aspect that makes wealth centralization easier in proof of work is that because you're pinning your assurance to something based in physics, and that is this cryptographic hash that we know how much energy on average it takes to produce. Because of that, it's feasible to think of anyone who has sufficient wealth already to be able to enter into the system and become a major miner. Like it's not impossible for Apple to say, okay, we're going to become a major Bitcoin miner, and then they make the foundries and they make these new ASICs, and now they're competing directly with Bitmain. Whereas in proof of stake, to stake you need the coins. So to get the coin, and because the coins float on a price that is kind of fundamental to the system, it could be feasibly difficult for someone to become a large staker later on, um, if they were to go about it wrong. If they kind of made their intention known, then a lot of people could just start holding really hard, and the price would go up, and to the extent that like it almost might be very hard to even enter into that to get enough coins to become a large staker. But that's really a fringe comment, if I had to be totally honest. We just need more data on proof of work versus proof of stake, and just wealth centralization in general. I mean, Bitcoin's only been around for what is it, 10 years now, 8 years? And proof of stake, I would say the first real one launched last week. And that's Cosmos. So we'll see. It's going to be interesting. As for the second bit, how to widely fairly distribute wealth after having private sales. Our approach is just to keep the private sales pretty small, and not have like a multi-billion-dollar valuation for the network type of deal where there's just going to be this huge amount of tokens that are locked up by the first people. I think the other part is that it's an aspect of at least how Chainweb works, in that as utilization increases and we hard fork to larger and larger networks, it becomes feasible for people to do kind of Merkle mining of individual chains. So I expect to see pools on Chainweb by this time next year. And so because you're doing that, you end up having these pockets of people who are running who are replicating a couple nodes, or a couple chains, and they're mining on a couple chains, and it allows for higher decentralization, so that like you can effectively just start decentralizing the mining a bit more. But it's like I kind of, at the end of the day, I'm an engineer at heart. I want something that works, and we'll figure out the rest second. I know this stuff matters, but I want something that works. And because a lot of the people who are going to try using this stuff at first, they're not the richest people. They're people who they're putting a lot of their net worth into a project that's on top of these platforms. And the idea that they could end up in a situation like Parity Multisig, where they had, let's say a third of their net worth, and it wasn't even that much, locked up on a multi-sig contract, and then it gets locked, and now you can't go and get that capital out. That to me is worse. So my first kind of instinct in all of this is to be an engineer and to have something that fails safe, and that is something that won't really screw you over when you try to use it.
Yeah, yeah. So, Will, you mentioned Chainweb, and I want to take a minute to have us answer some questions we're getting about Chainweb. So, user at CryptoNight asks, how does Kadena's version of proof of work differ from the traditional proof of work introduced by Bitcoin, and how does it improve on it?
So it's a good question. Fundamentally, it is a chain web is an architecture that you apply to proof of work to more efficiently use or efficiently leverage the energy used for mining a block or for mining the system. Um, it isn't that different, kind of at the base layer idea. The only difference is that instead of having, when you mine a new block in Bitcoin, you, you reference the previous block in the chain. With Chainweb, you reference the previous block of your chain and some peers of the network. So if you have 10 chains and each chain is referencing both its previous block and that of two of the peers, but not the entire network. So it isn't that it's that different. It's that you're allocating the proof of work energy use from mining just much more efficiently. Because now, for a finite unit of energy that would normally just give you one block, you're actually getting 10 blocks at the same height, which is giving you 10 times the throughput. But the overall energy use is effectively the same, because the amount of energy used for mining dominates all of the expenses, the rest of the expenses of running one of these networks.
So, so then we have another interesting question here. This is from at Oscar. He asks, how resilient is Kadena proof of work to brute force quantum computer attacks?
So, all right. So, actually, our head of research and networks, Monica Quaintance, is going to be up in Boston giving a talk on quantum computing and blockchain, I think tomorrow. So the name of the game for quantum computers and why people like if you're going to be worried about them, the thing to be worried about from the point of view of a blockchain, it's all about private keys and being able to break a private key from someone else. So you have billion or you have $1 million stored behind a private key on, let's say, Bitcoin or something, or on Ethereum, and someone goes and they use a quantum computer to figure out what that, they see the public key and they use a quantum computer to find the private key. Now, no one knows if this is actually possible. It's theoretically possible. The quantum computers required are still years, if not decades out. Proof of work, however, is talking more about hashing. And the thing with hashing is that we don't really know how to do much of beat up with quantum computers yet. We know how to there's been more research and more effort put into using it for curves for signatures, but for hashing itself, it uses a different kind of approach, a cryptographic approach. So let's say that, but even if so, let's say that it were actually possible to use a quantum computer to break the proof of work mining algorithm that Chainweb used. Now, what would you get out of it? And the really, it's almost hard for me to go and find something that you would really get out of it. You're not going to use that system for mining itself. That's just, it's an incredibly expensive system. So you're just not really going to use it. You're not going to use a quantum computer. I would say that at that point, were we to see that type of attack on Chainweb, we would probably end up switching the algorithm. But overall, I'm having trouble actually coming up with an upside for um, using it, because just because you can use a quantum computer to mine faster or better, it doesn't mean that you can collide a block, like collide a cryptographic hash. If that gets broken, then it's a bit different. But haven't seen any research that says that you can use a quantum computer to collide a 256-bit cryptographic hash in any reasonable time frame. Kyle, you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is actually Jimmy Song, who's a well-known Bitcoiner. He actually did a YouTube video on kind of touching on the subject maybe 6 or 12 months ago. And I think the video is called like "What Would Happen If SHA-256 was broken," which SHA-256 is the hashing algorithm in Bitcoin. And so when he says that's broken, what he really means is you would be able to, from an output, determine the input, which would imply that you could accelerate SHA-256 mining theoretically much faster than you can today. That would not break public key cryptography, meaning you would not actually be robbed. What it would do is likely it would just create a new arms race among miners who are now using this kind of algorithm that broke SHA-256. There's a pretty high probability of a large one-time block reorg. Large, I don't know if large is 10 blocks, 100 blocks, 1,000 blocks, 10,000 blocks. That's unclear to me how large is large, but you likely would have one very large reorg, and then after that, the system would basically kind of merge back to something that looks something like the status quo.
Right, right, Kyle. So I actually have a question for you, and this goes back a little bit more to the energy consumption, and this is in regards to miners. How can we reduce the size of the blockchain? Could it be possible to hold a node inside of like a mobile device? How can we make these huge blockchains? For example, Ethereum is huge. You have to download the blockchain history. It's gigabytes. Like how can we transition from that and make it just more accessible for people?
Yeah, so there's a lot of ways to make blockchain more accessible. One is if you can make the whole blockchain fit on a phone. The only team that I'm aware of that's focusing on that specific problem, quite literally as you described it, is a team called Coda, which is based in San Francisco. Multicoin happens to be an investor in Coda. They use some interesting zero-knowledge proof technologies to make that happen. It's not clear that that's what is the bottleneck preventing many people from using blockchains, and you can make a lot of pretty reasonable arguments that it's not the primary bottleneck. So, to answer your question, technically it's doable. Not sure that it's the thing preventing people from using the system. My suspicion is in the long run, you will be able to access blockchain seamlessly from your phone, you may not need to run the whole thing locally, but you'll be able to access everything you need to access from a mobile device.
Yeah, the only other project I can add to that is Grin is they're not focused directly on putting it on mobile, but they are focused on keeping the overall size of the chain database down by using these are Peterson commitments, not I don't think they're technically I don't know if they count as zero knowledge proofs. At least they're a much better understood version. So here's one thing to keep in mind when thinking about the chains that are focused on keeping the overall size of the blockchain small is that you need to use some clever cryptography to be able to do it, to be able to compress all the transactions. And when you do that, so ZK works. We know how to use ZK for simple balance transactions or simple ledger transactions. But once you go beyond that and want to have arbitrary logic like a smart contract, the state space of how ZK works blows up way beyond exponentially. I think it's either factorial or something even crazier. So, if you want to have smart contracts and a really small size to get it onto your phone, it's at this point, I don't think there's any research that's showing that it's going to be possible. My kind of default to this is that, um, you know, if you're, it depends on what the project is kind of going after. With Kadena, we're trying to have, Chainweb is designed to be a really fat throughput for public transactions or a public network for transactions, and that means that we're going to be doing upwards of 1,000 10,000 transactions a second. Under adoption will be hard forked to that size, and if you're doing, let's say, 10,000 transactions a second, and you're doing it on a public network that's supposed to be decentralized and validated by everyone, then you need to replicate 10,000 transactions a second. And it's just a lot of data. And there's no real way to get around that. You can do better things with the backend than Ethereum did, which is what we're doing for. When we launch testnet, we have kind of an early pass at it, and then we're going to take another pass at it and make it even more efficient to keep the overall size of the database on a per chain basis small. But fundamentally, you end up with just if you're running 10 and you're doing that for years, it's just a lot of data that you have to replicate, and there's really no kind of way around it. And I'm okay with that at a personal level. I don't think that having a mobile device that's capable of replicating a full node on your phone is really standing in the way of adoption. I think that what's standing in the way of adoption is just the UX of public private key cryptography, and that's why I'm really happy to see Samsung adding crypto hardware wallets to their phone. I think that they're going to have some defaulted DApps in that kind of secure enclave, that hardware security module they put on phones, is going to help to push adoption pretty significantly. I think we're also going to end up seeing it with Apple because they already have a secure enclave that you can sort of use for holding private keys. And once you get past that, then it's going to go to the point where you have a much easier time using it versus using something like setting up your ledger and then doing your paper wallet and then figuring out how to have good multi-sig for it. If you can get it to the point where it's just a phone app but it's still secure, I think that that's the thing that's really standing in the way.
Yeah, totally. So we're at our 10-minute mark and we have room for about two, maybe three more questions. So this one is from our good friend Miner Wizard, and he's asking, oracles and the omnidirectional design seem to be a godsend to modern day smart contract complexities. However, what challenges are your teams facing in providing a novel solution like this? So let's start with what?
So oracles and omnidirectional design. Huh. Um, for challenges, I would say probably the challenges are ones that we've already faced, and that comes from Stu and I's background in finance. I think collectively we have 20 years doing fintech, and knowing so smart contracts especially. There's a certain type of engineer who sees smart contracts and their jaw hits the floor. Also, our recently hired, I think 3 or 4 months ago, tech PM Anaga immediately got private blockchains and smart contracts because she's lived in this environment of big enterprise back offices where you have this incredibly messy this thing that holds the state of the company, this database. And it's this huge mess, and you get called up on, like, 2 a.m. on a Sunday because it went down and your application failed, because some new developing team, in some other office, decided to go and add some part to the application, and they didn't have the full background of how the application, of how the database is supposed to be structured, and they screwed something up, and then everything broke. Like, this happens on a pretty regular, not completely regular, but not irregular basis, in big companies. E-commerce sites too. Our first hire, Monica, she was at Rent the Runway. She was the main systems engineer there, and she had the same thing of being on call 24/7, having the prod database go down because someone added something new and it crashed it. So the pain points really are kind of those, and all the learnings, because when you're in that environment, you have a very good sense for what a if you were to reimagine smart contracts from scratch, what you would want them to have and what they would need to be able to actually integrate with larger corporations. So in Pact, for example, we have you have to be able to upgrade smart contracts. So when you make a smart contract in PAX, the first thing you do is you give it a name. The second thing you do is you give it a function that governs it. And this can be arbitrary. It can be Ethereum style governance where you just can't upgrade it ever. It can be a simple multi-sig, which is a natively supported aspect of Pact as well, or it can be a decentralized vote, or it can be any mix. It can also be crazy things like every Tuesday that happens to be a prime number. Anyone who has, I don't more than 10 coins in some ledger can go, or some ERC 20 equivalent can go and perform an upgrade. I mean, I wouldn't do that, but you could, because it's just a generalized solution. But also, it has a native key value database metaphor. So smart contracts actually create the data, like create tables that go into a traditional database. Right now, we use SQLite for our backend for the public chain, but we have multiple backends, so like MySQL, Postgres, whatever. So that allows you to then have a much easier time integrating the smart contract layer with the existing or the soon to be existing back office database that we've all been knowing and loving for the last 30 years, so like a Postgres or a MySQL. In addition to that, we knew when we were designing Pact that we needed to have a way of doing um, kind of asynchronous calls externally to be able to go and get data and pull it in. And these are what are called pacts in Pact, PACTS. And these are coroutines, so they're multi-step transactions. Think of them like whenever someone says oracles, from the point of view of blockchain, my first thought is the Bloomberg API, because the Bloomberg API is a type of thing that you can represent as a contract, put it on a blockchain, and then you can have other contracts, so long as you have the ability for contracts to interact, come and query that contract, pay a small fee, have that contract, so have the servers that are supporting it go off and grab the data that you need and pull it back onto the main chain, and then have the initiating transaction continue. So probably the main pain, to sum it up, is our experience. Pact is a wonderfully easy to use language. It's designed by developers for, I would say developers, but also for lawyers and executives to be able to read and write, which makes it unbelievably easy to use from a dev perspective.
Great. Do you have anything to add to that, Kyle?
No, I think Will just about covered everything on that one.
For sure, I agree. So let's do this one. It's a really fun question. So imagine it's 20 years in the future and one of these consensus mechanisms become obsolete. What would be the most likely reason for the downfall of proof of work or proof of stake, sorry. So we'll start with you, Kyle.
So I think it's unlikely that either one of these dies anytime soon. If we were going to secure trillions of dollars of the world's value using these things, it makes sense to hedge your bets and just kind of have money on both. So I don't think they're either as likely to die soon. If anything, like the concerns for proof of stake are they're just so much more complex. There's just a lot more things that can go wrong. The concern for proof of work is you don't have some of the nice benefits of things like fast finality that kind of come with proof of work. It's unclear to me which of those variables matters kind of on a 20 or 30-year time horizon in terms of kind of thinking about tail risk. So unclear, but smart people are working on all of the above, and hopefully we never come to that situation.
Yeah, I can't. I mean, Kyle definitely kind of hit the nail on the head on it. I really can't. You know, these things. I mean, obsolete is, I guess, the type of thing that could potentially happen. They're never going to just kind of stop working. And if they're superseded by something better, um, it's really kind of hard to say. Maybe. All right, I'm gonna reach out really far and just say something kind of crazy then. Let's say that we were able to have a mesh net, an effective mesh net that is globally spanning. I think that you may end up with a kind of weird consensus protocol that looks more like a gossip network that could run on top of it at that point. And so maybe that, because at that point things can be so decentralized that, and where it's literally running on every device and everything's connected to everything else pretty directly, and there's no worry about censorship, that maybe, just maybe, there might be some novel consensus protocol in there that looks more gossipy than anything else. But I mean, it's going to be hard for proof of work to ever be obsolete. And proof of stake's kind of outside of the fast finality aspects of proof of stake. Proof of stake is fundamentally just trying to replicate what proof of work can do. So it's almost kind of like, what feature, and I'm having trouble grasping it, of like, what extra feature could we add to a public consensus and a public open consensus protocol that would be a total game changer um, from a uptake perspective. I'm having a hard time finding.
Yeah, great. So I want to give you guys a chance to shout out any projects within the space that you are both interested in, or just any project you're excited about in general.
Kyle, you want to start?
Yeah, so one thing I'm pretty excited about is key management solutions. I think key management has been just generally an under um, we have the industry has not devoted enough energy into kind of trying to devise novel key management systems that are usable for consumers, that deliver the kind of security guarantees and assurance guarantees that people want. I think this year we're going to see a number of key management solutions roll out that deliver a true seamless experience. It's actually not clear to me that what Samsung is rolling out is going to be particularly good on this front. As a simple example, while the Samsung solution may be great for that Samsung phone, most users today use applications across multiple devices. So you need to be whatever that system does on the Samsung phone, you need to be able to export that private key somehow and get it into another device. Um, Once you do that, you introduce all kinds of new security parameters and risks. Once you do that, you need to have a backup and a syncing solution. Once you do that, you need an account recovery system. And so you very quickly realize that while what Samsung did is great, I'm very happy they're doing it. I just don't think it's kind of a holistic solution for solving key management for users. And so I think this year we're going to see a number of the key management systems roll out. We did just invest in one recently. I'm unfortunately not at liberty to name it just yet, but I'm very excited to see that space get that layer of the stack improve, because as it improves, I think the user experience for all blockchain-based applications is going to improve substantially.
Yeah. I mean, on that front, I totally agree. The key management is it's such a pain in the butt. I mean, the one that I've always keep my radar is Anchorage, which is Diogo Monica's. They've got some amazing tech and some really interesting approaches where, to make sure that the binaries haven't been undermined for the replicating servers, they they replicate and they redo the actual. Oh, sorry, I logged out. Logged out of my computer by accident. They what is it? They actually rebuild pretty much all their infrastructure. I think it's every 2 days or something from scratch, just to make sure that in case something got undermined, it isn't long lived. Um, as for the various hardware security modules, there is another kind of solution to it, which is that if you have native multisig in the um, in baked into how the platform works, you could do something where like you have your Samsung key and you have your your Ledger Nano S key and you have some other key that are used for, and those comprise a multi-sig wallet. But instead of getting 2 of 3 signatures, you're going to do something like have 1 of 3, where it's just like you have once you have your device, like you can kind of sign a transaction from many of your devices, and that way you don't have to migrate your private keys around, because that is a huge problem and kind of the core of what a hardware security module is supposed to avoid. As for other projects, just Go Cosmos. Always been a big fan of them. So happy to see them launching. I'm finding it fascinating watching the race for validators to get stakers and watching the fees go down. Outside of that, and they're probably the one that I'm just the biggest fan of. So just Go Cosmos.
Awesome. So I want to ask the both of you, what can we look out for from each of you soon? So Kyle?
Yeah, I mean, look, well, I'm going to keep publishing stuff on our blog. I'm going to keep making funny comments on Twitter, and I'll be around at events. I think the next kind of major public event I'm going to, I think, is Consensus in May. I'm going to a few smaller ones in April. But I'm also just generally accessible on Twitter, so feel free to ping me anytime on Twitter. My Twitter name is @KyleSamani.
And Will?
Yeah, this is a lot of fun. Thanks again, Kyle, for swinging by. Best place to follow me is maybe on Twitter. I mean, it's @_WJ_Martino_. And but otherwise, just it's by Kadena.io for more information, and you can just ping me on Kadena's Discord. I'm really enjoying using this platform and happy to see that we're moving away from Telegram.
Awesome. So I want to thank everybody for coming in and listening to the both of these individuals. They're great guys. Make sure you do follow them on Twitter. And we want to make sure that your questions are answered. So continue to leave them in Ask Kadena, and the Kadena team will try to get to everybody. And we want you to also sign up for our newsletter. It's kadena.io/newsletter. Sign up. You'll stay updated for some more AMAs in the future. And just thank you, everybody. So we'll take off. See you guys soon.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks.